So I've been authorized today to talk to you about class. And most specifically, I want to talk to you about class composition as a call to arms. Now, in general, there are several different aspects to class. There is the orthodox Marxist notion of class composition, which we're all familiar with. There are the Marxist and other expansions to class composition. But then there is also the rejection of orthodox class composition. And in the end, I actually want to advocate for a return to the orthodox Marxist understanding of class composition. So with that, we should ask the question, what is the orthodox Marxist notion or concept of class composition? In this case, it's very simple. Two main things: the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois control the means of production. They control the factories, they control the supply lines, they control the stores. They control the ways by which people reproduce themselves. Which is to say, they control the ways by which you feed yourself, you clothe yourself, you get a home, you get a family, you have your entertainment. The bourgeois ultimately control the means of humanity's production. And as such, because they control the means of production, directly and indirectly, they are the ruling class. Where, in the case of Chile, the business leaders are simply the rulers, it's quite clear that the bourgeois are the ruling class. But here as well, one cannot be elected to president, to Senate, to the House of Representatives without the funding necessary. And as Engels says, in liberal democracy, capital rules indirectly, and through that, all the more surely. So again, under classic orthodox Marxist conceptions, the bourgeois owns the means of production and is the ruling class. And opposed to them, there is the proletariat, the workers. Those who do not own the means of production. Those that are forced to sell their bodies and their lives hour by hour in order to gain a modicum of subsistence. A few hours of pleasure at a movie. A vestige of an education from a public state school. These are the workers. And because they do not own the means of production, they are, in any normal circumstance, at the mercy of those who do. Of the bosses, of the managers, or even indirectly to the investment bankers who issue loans that cause their companies, their stores that they work at, to collapse. Again, they do not own the means of production, and because they don't own the means of production, they're not the ruling class. But the proletariat have a very special characteristic, which is they also can be the revolutionary class. As Marx famously said in the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." The reproduction of capital for profit, for exploitation, pushes more and more workers, as we're seeing now through this economic downturn, to the edge and the brink of bankruptcy, poverty, and destruction. The proletariat in orthodox class composition is the revolutionary class. However, we notice through historical contingencies, the industrial factory worker is almost rarely the only revolutionaries. They are rarely as a class the only revolutionaries. Which leads us to three main contributions to the notion of class analysis. Those by Lenin, those by Trotsky, and those by Mao. Lenin, of course we know, the radical theorist and revolutionary of Russia, later to become the Soviet Union, argued that the peasants themselves can contingently become a revolutionary class. Peasants as a class are individual farmers exploited either directly or indirectly by landlords. Either they work the landlord's land, or they are subject to complex social arrangements so that large landowners ultimately control how their goods go to market. So Lenin noticed that these peasants who work and slave and toil under either feudal or semi-feudal conditions, which is to say they have a lord or a landlord who basically exploits them, can enter into a temporary alliance with the proletariat, a temporary alliance with the industrial workers to defeat the ruling class, aristocrats and capitalists. But then they ultimately need to make that transition from a peasant, an individual landowner or someone who works someone else's land for their own production, into an agricultural worker. That is, someone who works, but they themselves do not directly own the means of production. The idea being that we get rid of individually owned farms, nationalize them, and make them state-run farms, of which the peasants become essentially agricultural proletariat, farm workers. And so, of course, this is an important distinction. Mexican immigrants today are not peasants. They do not work for a tithe. They do not work for a feudal lord. They are agricultural proletariat. They work in the factory farm. So, again, this is an important distinction between someone who is exploited and someone who works, and their relation to the means of production. For a peasant, they have a direct relation, but then they are exploited, Their goods, a percentage of their harvest is taken from them. Now, for Lenin, again, he believed that they could be temporary allies, but then they would ultimately need, to convert to proletariat, which, of course, happened under Stalin and collectivization. But he also noticed another interesting feature of the proletariat and another sort of class, which is the labor aristocracy. And those of you who are here for the Lenin lecture will certainly remember this. Imperialism, that invades other countries is able to bring materials and products back in. And not just concrete material, like invasion of, for example, the British Empire that invades a country and puts troops and then puts people to work, but also imperialism through capital. For example, in Ethiopia, where we sent over a bunch of investment funds, brought the price up, and then sold it all off, There are ways to imperialize besides soldiers. And, of course, Lenin believed that you can just invest capital in a country and ultimately bleed it dry. A good example, again, would be Mexico. We don't have many American soldiers on Mexican soil, but yet they are still bound to us through our investments, through our corporations, through our financial capital. Now, an interesting thing happens to these imperialist nations. They get extra. They get a surplus that they could just give to themselves, as the capitalists, but they notice that if they distribute this surplus from imperialism a little better among the workers, give them just a little bit more, a little bit cheaper television, a little bit cheaper food, these workers lose their revolutionary core. They become satisfied with their daily existence, which is still alienating, which is still filled with mindless labor. But the very fact that they could have 2 cars, their own house, essentially buys them off. This is what Lenin calls as a class the labor aristocracy. And so, of course, even though they have the form of the proletariat, they are in fact not a revolutionary class. They've been bought off.